When someone enters a prison to spend the rest of their life there, they essentially stop living, no matter which prison is it. But if that prison is one of the most notorious of the modern era, reaching the end of life becomes much easier or happens much sooner. If that prison is Alcatraz, one of the most feared prisons in the world, a person stops living the moment they step foot in that terrifying place. Alcatraz, a fortress among the waves, is an island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, essentially a rock in the sea with a maximum security prison atop it, one of the worst prisons on earth. Famous inmates like Al Capone, George Kelly, famous for Machine Gun, one of the biggest alcohol smugglers, and the witty Bulger, the infamous outlaw depicted in Martin Scorsese's movie The Departed, where Jack Nicholson played his character, all called Alcatraz home. Most importantly, there was Frank Morris, about whom we'll speak more. For all these men, Alcatraz was like home. They called it the Rock House. The distance from Alcatraz to the San Francisco shoreline is under just 2 kilometers, a distance that feels like an entire world to the inhabitants of Alcatraz. This is because escaping from Alcatraz was nearly impossible. Prisoners who tried to escape over the years by crossing icy waters, battling the deadly waves in the middle of fog, mist, wind and storms, and of course, in the fight against deadly predators from the prison guards to great white sharks and terrifying sea creatures, were always unsuccessful. They either disappeared without a trace, their bodies were found, or they were caught and returned to the Rocky House. However, there is one possibility in the history of Alcatraz that we'll soon discuss. Before anything else, let's go over the history of Alcatraz itself and see how this strange and formidable prison came to be. Until the late 18th century, this island was uninhabited. At that time, the Spanish had arrived in America. Fast forward to 1775, the beginning of the wars that led to the American Revolution. Wars between Great Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands were ongoing. And in the midst of this, a Spanish officer named John de Alaya was searching for a good military base for his country, Spain. He searched and searched until he found this awesome rock jutting out of the water, close to the mainland. Senior John named this rock Yerba Buena. When asked what it means, he said herb. Later on, the name of the rock was changed to Alcatraz. But where does this name come from? It derived from a Spanish word albatros, which means pelican. In Spanish, the bird pelican is called albatros. Now the question is, why was this name given to the rock? The island was full of pelicans, but as we talk today, that's no longer the case. All pelicans on Alcatraz were killed. Let's jump ahead 20 years to 1846, when the Alcatraz rock was an unimportant military era until an event occurred that year. A man named Julian Workman came to this island with the promise of building a lighthouse. He seized Alcatraz, claimed it for himself, and instead of constructing the lighthouse, he went to the military governor of California, John C. Fremont, and sold the island for $5,000. There is where history takes a turn, as Fremont established a military base on Alcatraz in the name of the United States government. Fast forward to the mid-19th century, when the gold rush swept across America. Everyone was after gold, and many prospectors flocked to San Francisco believing it was a gold-rich era. As a result, the population surged dramatically, prompting the government to establish a military base to maintain order and security. And where better than the Pelican Island? Does it happen that the most important part of this island became the military prison that was constructed in its center? A military prison for deserters and military offenders. Our discussion revolves around this prison. With the onset of the American Civil War in 1861, the function of the prison gradually changed. It became known as a prison we recognize today as Alcatraz. The war was between the North and the South, and at that time, Alcatraz was under the control of northern United States. It becomes a prison for Confederate prisoners. Even after the end of the Civil War, Alcatraz remained a military prison. However, in 1930s, specifically in 1933, with the rise of criminal activities and organized crime, the United States decided to dedicate a very special prison for these particular criminals. And what better place than Alcatraz? An escape-proof prison, Alcatraz was designed to isolate public nuisance until the end of their life. What kind of prison was Alcatraz? Why did it become so famous? To answer this better, let's turn to the story of one of the inmates, a prisoner who was fortunate enough to leave this terrifying prison on his own 2 feet, Jim Quillen. According to Jim himself in the beginning of his book, he had a very difficult childhood which naturally led him towards crime. He began stealing and eventually escalated to kidnapping. His crime continued to grow larger, and finally, in 1942, he was arrested and sent to prison. However, Jim was quite a tough guy. He quickly escaped from his first prison. After being recaptured, the judge told him he would be sent to a place from which he couldn't escape. Consequently, Jim Quillen was sentenced by the court to 45 years of hard labor for his specified crimes. Jim's imprisonment, however, did not last long. I will explain why, but before I do, let's talk about the chaotic period he experienced while at Alcatraz. For example, on May 2nd, 1946, a bank robber named Bernard Coyle, along with 5 others, attacked the guards, disarming them. They intended to take hostage and escape by boat into the open water. However, this was not an easy task. Alcatraz was quickly surrounded. For 2 days, there was an armed conflict between the guards and 6 rebels. In the end, 2 hostages were killed and 3 of the rebels were shot dead by the security forces. After the uprising ended, the prison guards remained and 3 rebels were left. One of those 3 was sentenced to life in prison, while the other 2 received death sentence as a lesson for other inmates in Alcatraz. This was just one of Jim's memories during his short time in Alcatraz. During his imprisonment, Jim witnessed this uprising and several escape attempts. He concluded that there was no way to escape from Alcatraz. Later on, where his mother passed away, he received the news and became heartbroken and depressed. He made a decision and behaved so well afterward that the prison authorities concluded that he had reformed. They decided to reduce his sentence from 45 years to 10 years. Thus, Jim Quillen walked out of Alcatraz in 1952. The reason I mentioned that his imprisonment was short is that 10 years considered a very short time in Alcatraz. Ultimately, when he got out, he wrote a book about his memories of 10 years on that remote rock. Let's delve a bit into Jim Quillen's memories. In his book, he gave Alcatraz 2 nicknames, the Pit and Hell. Jim described his life in cells that were so damp they could make a prisoner sick. It's really terrifying. In his book, Jim Quillen mentions that we lived in a cell full of moisture and filth, which were usually in complete darkness. Alcatraz was insulated in such a way that no sound from anywhere could come in. This meant that the inmates heard nothing, and this silence made them feel completely cut off from the outside world. These conditions led to psychological troubles. In any case, Alcatraz was somewhat like this. No sound came from outside, even though it was built on a rock and was constantly battered by terrifying waves. But there was no sound. This silence, along with moisture, filth, and darkness, was enough to break a person down. Although the authorities at Alcatraz had other measures to quickly wear down inmates who showed too much bravado. Quillen says that in our block, the prison day started at 6:30 in the morning. This morning began with a strange deafening bell and rang in each cell. No light entered our cells. And with shouting and insults, they demanded that inmates get up quickly and stand in their designated spots. Getting out of bed was usually a hard task. Our bone ached. The atmosphere was damp, there was no light, it was filthy, and no sound come from outside. We didn't even know it was the morning until the shouting and ultimately the beatings forced us to get out of bed. We would stand there, almost on alert. All these events mean that breakfast was ready. They would throw a metal container at us, and the sound was truly deafening in that silence. That was our breakfast, although the food we ate really didn't resemble breakfast. It was more like filth. We didn't know, but we thought other prisons in other countries must have served similar food. I would see a light that I would greedily consume. Then we would find a mush in the container, a piece of bread and a little mushroom in the middle of it. There was no milk or sugar. If we were lucky, we might find a cup of coffee in our container, but only if they felt like it. The duration of breakfast wasn't up to us. We couldn't tell the time. Eventually, after 20 minutes, everything would be over. Again, the doors would be closed for hours and the silence and darkness would return along with some old filth and silence. The light now was from a small opening in our cell. In the block we were in, the tiny opening was the same one that the demand guard would open to check our inmates. That small window was a treasure for us, but after breakfast or whatever mush you want to call it, it would be closed again for an entire day. If you could even tell it was day, of course it passed in darkness. They would give us 2 more meals, but the same thing would happen. The hallways would open again with shouting and curses to get up and be alert. But when they served breakfast, more light would hit our skin. 20 minutes of morning sunlight. You know, the cells had no ventilation. They were much colder than you might imagine. Have you ever been outside in winter without clothes? Of course they give us clothes, but very little. It was so thin that it didn't protect you from anything. Beside those clothes, we had nothing else. What were those clothes? Just one piece of underwear, one sock, and a thin outer garment that wouldn't last 2 months, especially if someone didn't take it from you. The ceilings and walls of our cells were made of aluminum, which only increased the cold and humidity. You might wonder if there was any physical torture in Alcatraz. Jim answers that question in his book. The torture we're talking about was all these events combined with lack of movement, which gradually made the prisoner feel lethargic and sluggish. There were no sign of beating or torture on our body. You know, the guards were exonerated from charge of assault, but the main torture was psychological. They tortured the spirits of the prisoners. And now I'd like to add one point to Jim's remarks, the famous Al Capone. When this man was sent to Alcatraz because of the environment that Jim Collin described, eventually became mentally ill due to that very atmosphere. They say he went insane and he spent the last months of his sentence in a mental hospital. Al Capone ultimately passed away in that unstable mental condition. Every prisoner has outdoor time. Prisoners need fresh air, especially when human prisons were at the end of dark and damp black holes, and prisoners essentially had no right to see the sky at all. However, as we move forward in the history to the 20th century, essentially during the time that we're discussing, human right has started to gain some definitions, and these definitions have progressed to this day. But how much progress has been made and how much it is acted upon is up to your judgment. However, Alcatraz had outdoor time. Yes, Jim Collin also confirmed that this prison had outdoor time, but what kind of outdoor time was it? They said if you were a good boy and didn't cause trouble, meaning you had to do everything we told you to do, you could go outside once in every 19 days. Of course, this was in our block. It was a reward for us. If the guard deemed it appropriate, you could come out every 19 days to brush your teeth and get some fresh air. We even get to take a shower. But after that, you had to get back to your cell. This encouragement wasn't something you could look forward to because practically after 19 days when the cell door opened, you couldn't move. At that moment, the only thing on your mind was the regard of past days. If during those 19-day period you weren't a good boy and made noise, you wouldn't get any outdoor time until the next 19 days. It didn't matter if you were good in between. The whole 19 days had to pass. If you weren't good, you'd have to wait for next 19 days and maybe even longer. Many people I knew didn't come out for several months. This miserable situation was unbearable for prisoners. As a result, the dream of escape was certainly on the minds of all Alcatraz prisoners. Prison authorities, however, did everything they could to prevent anyone from escaping. In Alcatraz, there was one trained security officer for every 3 prisoners, and the inmates were checked 12 times a day to see if they were in their place or not. Nevertheless, escape remained a constant temptation. The prisoners could only see the open space during the outdoor time and the beautiful beaches of San Francisco, which seemed very close, less than 2 kilometers away, and it looked like a nice place to dive and swim. There were several attempts to escape from Alcatraz Prison. And what were the results? Well, in total, there were 14 recorded escape attempts by 36 inmates. To be more detailed, 2 of them attempt to escape twice. And what were the results? Well, 23 were captured by authorities, 6 were shot and killed during the escape, 2 surrounded while escaping, and 5 went missing. In a way, they were considered drowned. No successful escape has been recorded in the history of Alcatraz, and it really seems like the prison was impossible to escape from. So far, we've talked about the condition of Alcatraz, that is on a rock, facing a bay with fog, cold rain, and 1,000 other challenges. When you put all this together, the difficulty of escaping from this prison wasn't just about outsmarting the guards. If someone managed to get past the guards, they still have to contend with nature. Then came the turbulent sea, a foggy bay, in fact, along with great white sharks that roamed the cold water of San Francisco Bay. This wild nature made escaping difficult. But on the other hand, it also made things easier. Why? Because the iron bars and barbed wire of the prison rust in such environment. These conditions actually made it easier to escape from Alcatraz. Let's take an example of how nature was used to assist in escaping this prison. In 1959, Paul Scott, a bank robber, entered Alcatraz as inmate number 1403. He endured 3 years in that hell until December 16, 1962, when it became too difficult to continue. He teamed up with his friend Darryl Parker, who was 31 years old. Together, they devised an escape plan and attempt to put it into action. And they succeeded. How did they do it? They cut through the decayed bars in the prison basement, which had rotted away due to moisture. They made their way to the water, and by the time the guards noticed the escape of these 2 men, Paul Scott was standing on a rock about 50 meters away from the island. But what happened next? The body of Darryl Parker was found stuck to the supports of the Golden Gate Bridge. But Paul Scott, the bank robber, managed to reach the dry land. This was the first and last officially confirmed escape attempt from Alcatraz, and during this escape, he managed to get to dry land. But the question arises, was the escape successful? No. When this man swam to shore, he couldn't even catch his breath, he couldn't even take a single step, he just collapsed. And the authorities were waiting right above him. They said, "Welcome." It was clear they knew that anyone who could swim through those turbulent water and reach the point wouldn't be able to walk. So while initially nature helped Scott by providing him with decayed bars, the same wild nature prevented him from succeeding. One was stuck to the Golden Gate Bridge, while the second one collapsed as soon as he arrived and said, "Oh gosh, take me back, I want to sleep, I'm tired." In the end, Paul Scott was returned to Alcatraz and sentenced life imprisonment. The most famous escape from Alcatraz actually involves 3 people, not just these 2. This event occurred in 1962, 6 months before the unsuccessful escape of Scott and his friend. In a way, this 3-person escape gave Scott the courage to attempt his own. So what was the story? 3 inmates from Alcatraz attempted to escape, and this escape remains shrouded in mystery to this day. Although many people have reached definitive conclusions about it, there is no concrete evidence. Now, who were these 3 individuals and what was the story? One of them was named Frank Morris, who has been arrested for drug trafficking and armed robbery. Since he had previously attempted to escape from the Louisiana State Prison, he was sent to Alcatraz. In fact, he had tried to escape from the Louisiana prison in 1960. Now, 2 years later, he wanted to escape from Alcatraz. In Alcatraz, he, along with 2 brothers named John and Clarence Anglin, spent months planning this escape. The 2 brothers were bank robbers and were well known among criminals for their swimming abilities. One interesting detail is that the water in Alcatraz prison was kept quite warm. Why was it warm? It was not for comfort, actually. The goal was to prevent the inmates' bodies from getting used to cold water, and so they wouldn't be prepared for an escape, as the surrounding waters were very, very cold. Nevertheless, the warm water did not stop these 3 from attempting to escape. Interestingly, Frank Morris, the leader of the trio, had an IQ score of 133. These 3 inmates used the material available in prison to build a raft and plan to escape on their handmade boat to dry land. They were quite innovative. For example, they had stolen a vacuum cleaner motor and turned it into a drilling machine, or even created a periscope. A periscope is a device with L-shaped tube and mirror that allows you to see above water while remaining submerged. It's often used in submarines. However, working in that environment was difficult. They were very resourceful and even made a makeshift flashlight. The most important invention was the dummies they placed in their beds during the escape to trick the guards. It's worth noting that the rule at Alcatraz was that lights went out in general population cells at 9:30 p.m., making it difficult for guards to notice anything unusual. In that darkness, the guards couldn't tell what the dummies were made of. They had created a combination of soap and other materials, for example, 3 human heads made of concrete. They had made 3 heads and glued real human hair on them, which they had stolen from the prison barber shop. They had also painted their face on these concrete heads. The bodies were made of soap, which made it look like human bodies. In any case, from 9:30 p.m. to 6:30 a.m., these friends had time to execute their plan, and they did. They intended to break out through tunnels they had dug in the cell. The FBI documents show that these 3 genius inmates had anticipated everything and had solutions for all issues, except one predictable problem. On June 11, 1962, exactly the night they executed their plan, at 11:30 p.m., when these 3 likely launched their handmade raft into the water, one of the strongest tides ever reported in San Francisco Bay occurred. The water flow increased significantly and the waves became stronger. If conditions had been favorable, these 3 friends could have reached the San Francisco Bay safely with just a bit of paddling. However, under such circumstances, question arises. Did these 3 manage to reach the dry land? Adding to this situation were the crazy tidal currents, thick fog, and bone-chilling cold. The weather was strange as well. Now, let's answer the question. Some residents of San Francisco Bay say that they saw these 3 men come ashore and go about their lives. However, the FBI stated that they investigated and found that these men's goal was not to reach San Francisco Harbor. They intended to go on an island called Angel Island, which is about 3 kilometers away from Alcatraz. From there, they had further plans. There are people who say that the water current actually helped them that night. The current pulled them toward the San Francisco shore. In any case, after that night, the largest manhunt operation in US history began. The FBI announced that they wanted them alive or dead and set a reward for them. Weeks of searching began throughout San Francisco and even outside of it. But there were no results. Ultimately, the case of these 3 individuals were closed by FBI without any trace of them being found. How is this possible? FBI announced that the man drowned and died. They consulted a series of specialists who reconstructed the water flow conditions similar to that night and saw what the result was. Now the water becomes very turbulent, and this turbulence clearly affected the raft that these 3 men made as they headed towards the pillar of the Golden Gate Bridge. They saw that the raft was moving toward this bridge at a speed of about 6 kilometers per hour, and everything seems fine until they got close to the bridge. Suddenly, the raft stopped moving. Why? Because it was at the intersection of 2 major water currents, which caused the raft to remain stationary. This intersection not only prevented the raft from moving, but also caused it to spin violently. Eventually, something strange happened. A roundabout turned them back toward Alcatraz, the very place they had come from. Before continuing with the story of these 3 men, let's discuss another escape experience related to this. The experience that the FBI had in 1958. A prisoner named Aaron Bargett attacked a guard, escaped, and jumped into the waters west of Alcatraz. They searched for him for a week or 2 but couldn't find him. The other prisoners and his cellmates said that he had succeeded in escaping. However, a week or 2 later, his body was brought back to Alcatraz. The hope of all the escape-minded prisoners turned into despair. Aaron Bargett's body has been stuck to the rocks of Alcatraz, which is why they couldn't find him at first. This proves that no matter how you jump into San Francisco Bay from Alcatraz cliff, the wave would push you back against the rocks, making escape nearly impossible. Only someone who could overcome the water current could escape, which wasn't easy at all. However, someone like Paul Scott managed to do this 6 months after these 3 men escaped. He reached dry land but ultimately didn't survive. In practice, it didn't make a difference. Now, let's return to June 11, 1962, around 11:30 p.m. We can conclude that these 3 men faced a very difficult task. It was practically impossible for them to overcome the water current. On that stormy night in the bay, the waves were worse than usual, and with a handmade raft, it's highly likely that they met the same fate as Aaron Bargett. Ultimately, the bodies of these 3 famous escapees were never found. The FBI emphasized that all 3 inmates were certainly killed and that Alcatraz is essentially an escape-proof prison. What do local legends say? They claim that the escape of these 3 inmates is true and that was successful. They believe they were smarter than what people think and had a plan for this issue. Locals are convinced that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers easily escaped that night and lived free for the rest of their lives. The interesting point is that years later, a postcard was sent to the families of these 3 escapees. This postcard claimed to be from the 3 who escaped it and were never found. The FBI is rejecting any connection between the postcards and Maurice or the Anglin brothers. However, this incident reinforced the belief among locals that these 3 successfully escaped and experienced a free life. This belief has persisted to this day. Many still think their escape was successful and that FBI is lying. Perhaps this is why a year or 2 ago, US Marshals released age photos of 3 Alcatraz escapees using artificial intelligence, saying, "If they are alive, this is what they would look like. Let us know. We'll pay well." It was a way of announcing that they are still keeping an eye on everything. In any case, the case of these 3 escapees garnered so much attention that American director Don Siegel made a film called Escape from Alcatraz, which you've definitely heard of, featuring a brilliant performance by Clint Eastwood. While many films have been made about Alcatraz, this one is certainly the most famous. The story of Frank Murray's and the Engling brothers' escape drew worldwide attention to Alcatraz, a notorious prison where conditions were truly harsh. The residents of Alcatraz were among the most famous criminals in the US. While there were indeed some of the worst criminals, human rights activists gradually argued that no matter how bad someone is, it doesn't justify such a life for them. On the other hand, the US government stated that maintaining Alcatraz was not cost-effective. They could move prisoners elsewhere at a lower cost. Moreover, the building itself would likely collapse in 10 years. Ultimately, they concluded that it wasn't worth all expense, especially considering its notoriety. Let me remind you that security forces and guards at Alcatraz also had tough conditions. Their families were affected by the harsh environment on the island. Ultimately, Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, who was the Attorney General of the United States, issued a historic order that the Alcatraz prison should be closed. This order was given on March 21, 1963. With the closure of the prison, Alcatraz Rock remained unused until 1969. About 6 years later, a group that called themselves Native American tribes spontaneously occupied the abandoned prison building, claiming that their culture was in danger. They demanded that since there was no longer a prison, they wanted to build a cultural and educational center for Native Americans in this place. What did the US government ultimately do? Naturally, they forcibly removed the native from the island. However, they conceded to their demands and said they would build such a center for them, but not in Alcatraz, somewhere else. Fast forward to 1972. About 3 years later, when the National Park Service bought Alcatraz from military and established the Golden Gate recreational area there. Since then, the Alcatraz Museum has been hosting tourists interested in history of this notorious prison, attracting about 1 million visitors annually. It is one of the most visited tourist sites in America. Let me remind you that visiting this museum is not easy. You have to buy tickets and wait in line. The weather is not always pleasant, either too hot or too cold, and you are transported by a tour boat. You go to a specific time and return after an hour, which means there are certain limitations, and it truly requires interest. Additionally, once a year, visiting this museum becomes free online. You can search for it as the day changes every year. You can enter the prison with 360-degree view and see the place where, for example, Al Capone once walked. Some legal experts and criminologists believe that prison alone is not enough for punishing offenders. It should be located in a place where inmates can see and feel the outside social environment, so that when they are released, they do not commit crimes again. This is a perspective held by some legal experts and criminologists. On the other hand, others argue that having prison is good for crime prevention. People in society constantly see prisons as a deterrent and subconsciously avoid crime because of the awareness. This perspective focused on crime prevention also holds that when a prison becomes obsolete, it should be turned into a museum so that people can visit and learn from it. Some legal experts believe that prisons around the world have not effectively acted as social deterrents and that humanity has not succeeded in preventing crime and violence through prisons. There are even those who argue that excessive construction of prison and inhuman behaviors within them have led to increased hatred and crime. Which perspective is correct? Should prisons be visible? Should prisons focus on preventing and become museums? Should prisons even exist at all? The judgment is yours. Thanks for staying with me till the end of the video. Hope you'll enjoyed it. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and also press the notification bell. See you all in the next video. Take care.